Okay, so over to Vivek, who's going to talk about why are the police so racist? About 20 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for questions and discussion, and then we'll have the business end of the meeting. Okay?
Sure. Okay, Andy, can you give me a shout at about 15 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
I haven't actually got timing of this because I only wrote writing notes last night. So give me a shout at 15 minutes so I know where I am. Evening, comrades. It's a pleasure to be in Coventry, if only virtually. Look, clearly since the horrific murder of George Floyd, news stories have just keep coming out day in, day out about incidents involving the police. Just a few that occurred to me off the top of my head. Dawn Butler MP being stopped by the police. Danny Rose, Premier League footballer, being stopped by the police. A couple of weeks back, there was that athlete, Bianca Williams, stopped by the police. Now, it seems that the media has suddenly come across these incidents of police racial profiling, police stop and search, harassment of black people. But I think most of us who are in this meeting know that this is nothing new. This is an everyday experience for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, and has been for a very long time. Just some lower level cases, just to throw in the mix. I don't know if some of you saw, there was a little video circulating on WhatsApp 2 or 3 days ago about a nurse in Boreham Wood, black nurse coming out of a jeweler. She'd gone into jewelers to try and get a refund on something. One of the staff in the jewelers had phoned the police saying they thought she had drugs. So she was tackled in broad daylight in the street by 6 police officers. Clothing was disheveled. She was exposed in ways that you wouldn't want to be exposed. And it turned out she's a nurse for the NHS and had no drugs, nothing going on at all. A little while ago, near where I live in London, in Finsbury Park, 2 police officers were carrying out an arrest, and you'd think they'd know better. One of them knelt on the suspect's neck. And he's saying, "I can't breathe." Now, you'd think in the glare of publicity, they would know better than this. But as I say, this is an everyday routine occurrence for black people. I don't want to go through huge amounts of, but just a few to give you a flavour of how bad this is. Looking at stop and search in particular, if you're from any kind of ethnic minority, black, Asian, other ethnic minority, you're 4 times more likely to be stopped by the police. If you're black, Afro-Caribbean black, it goes to 10 times. And that gets worse depending upon where it is. That's kind of the averages for large urban centres. In Dorset, for instance, it's 25 times as likely to be stopped if you're Afro-Caribbean than if you're white. That's just stop and search. And I want to talk a little bit about stop and search because I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about here, really. Stop and search. The police have powers to stop and search under a whole number of bits of legislation. There's the Misuse of Drugs Act. There's Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE. There's anti-terrorism legislation. There are COVID powers to stop and search. Most particularly, the one I think is the most controversial, and one I'm going to focus on for a couple of minutes, is Section 60. Section 60 of the 1994 Public Order and Criminal Justice Act. Section 60 allows for police to stop and search without any requirement for reasonable grounds, on the belief that there is a reason to stop you. So the other powers require some kind of reasonable grounds. Section 60 does not require any reasonable grounds. Section 60 orders can be issued geographically, and 25% of them in London have been for the whole borough. When the regulations say it's supposed to be the smallest area possible, 25% of those issued have been for the whole of a London borough. And the same is true in other places. They can run for up to 48 hours. And and they absolutely give the police a blanket power to virtually do what they like at the with the authorization of the senior police officer for that borough, for that area. Section 60 powers have been at the sharp end of the harassment of black and ethnic minority people. I talked about stop and search figures earlier. With Section 60, it's 47 times more likely is the average across urban centres. God knows what it's like in Dorset under Section 60. If it's 25 times under ordinary powers, you get the idea. Stop and Section 60 searches have increased. They've increased almost fourfold in the last couple of years. And just the last thing I want to say about Section 60 is in London during COVID. Let me get the figure right. 21,950 searches of young black men. That's 25% of black men between 15 and 24 were stopped and searched between March and May, and 80% of those searches led to absolutely no further action at all. That's the nature of stop and search. You can not take this up a notch. If you look at the use of tasers, tasers were issued to the police to defend themselves under threat. Tasers are increasingly being used as an offensive weapon. I want to talk about. I live in Tottenham in North London. I'll talk about a couple of cases, 2 or 3 cases that come up locally. A 63-year-old man coming down the stairs to find out why the police had kicked in his door gets tasered. Not an accidental tasering, I don't think. It so happens this 63-year-old man is called Millard Scott. His younger brother is Stafford Scott, who ran the Broadwater Farm Defence Campaign after the uprising where PC Blakelock died. They knew who they were tasering. There's another case a couple of weeks later, a young 23-year-old man called Jordan Walker Brown, stopped by the police one day, searched for drugs. The police called to him the next day. He runs. He jumps over a wall. As he's jumping over the wall, they taser him. He is now paralyzed from the waist down, possibly for life. That's not using taser as a defensive weapon. That's using taser on someone who's running away from you, trying to jump over a wall to get away from you. That's using a taser as an offensive weapon. And they don't actually care. The last story I want to just relate on the taser is a gentleman called Andrew Boateng and his son Hugo. His son's 13. They're out for a cycle ride along the canal here in North London on a charity ride for a charity that's partly run by the police. The police stop them and threaten the 13-year-old with a taser. You know, they don't actually care. That, you know, there are people who are trying to work on community relations with the police. If you're black, you get tasered. You're 4 times more likely, in fact, the guardian now says 8 times more likely to be tasered, have a taser drawn on you if you're black than if you're white. You're 4 times more likely to actually be tasered if you're black than if you're white. And that 4 times figure goes on to violence against black people. Since let me get the figures right here. Yeah, since 1990, there have been 1,750 deaths following police contact. I hate that phrase. There have been 1,750 people killed by the police. No, their death following police contact is like collateral damage. It's trying to whitewash, excuse the pun, the actual reality. 1,750 people killed, disproportionately black. 3% of the population are black. 8% of those killed are black. That tells you what you need to know about police violence. And again, it's 4 times more likely you to experience violence at the hands of the police if you're black than if you're white. Okay, I think all of us will understand this. Or you wouldn't be in this meeting if you didn't think that there was a problem with the way the police interact with people from black and ethnic minority communities. The question really, and the title of the meeting is why? Why does this happen? And this has been a contested in the political space, I guess you could say, since the Stephen Lawrence report inquiry came out, the Macpherson report came out, when Macpherson described the Metropolitan Police's response to the death of Stephen Lawrence, killed by racists, he could only conclude that the Metropolitan Police are institutionally racist. And I want to explore what that actually means, because I think the list of the impacts of the statistics I've just related show that this is not just random acts. If you look at, let's say, in another case, if you look at Darren Cumberbatch, killed in the one room in the hostel by 4 police officers, the one room that didn't have any CCTV to record what happened to him. You know, there is a pattern here that goes beyond just random chance. I want to argue. I want to argue that there is something systemic going on, and I think to understand that, you even have to go beyond what Macpherson found in the Lawrence inquiry. Now, Macpherson, for those who don't remember, was a hand-picked, safe pair of hands, retired High Court judge who they thought would come out with the right answer to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. There's no problem here. It's just bad luck. You know, it's unfortunate the police didn't get to find the right people. It's unfortunate there's been no convictions. And incidentally, they've now dropped any further attempt to pursue justice for Stephen Lawrence. Quietly just said that in the midst of all the COVID crisis, hoping we wouldn't notice. Macpherson tried to say that there is something institutional. There's a racist culture that pervades the police, Metropolitan Police, from the very top right down through to the canteen. You talk about the canteen culture in the Metropolitan Police. I want to argue there's something more than that, something deeper than that, something that Macpherson wouldn't ever go there to say. I think to understand why the police are racist, I think I want to dismiss very quickly the idea that it's just individual bad apples. It's a question of unconscious bias or actual existing racism amongst police officers. Not that those two things don't exist. You know, there have been umpteen cases where police officers have been found with racist material. Just recently, a police officer in Enfield, a neighbouring borough to where I live, has been suspended because he didn't disclose the fact when he joined the police. He was a member of Britain First, a banned far-right organisation, a terrorist organisation, banned under terrorist legislation. There are umpteen cases like that. That police officers are both unconsciously racist and consciously, deliberately racist. But that isn't enough to explain the kind of stats that I've given. I think to understand what's going on with policing, I mean, incidentally, it goes beyond just the immediate contact with the police. David Lammy's report, Tottenham MP, 2017, talks about every level of the criminal justice system, from contact with the police to whether you're charged, well, what kind of sentence you get. All those things are discriminatory towards Black and minority ethnic communities. To understand that, I think you have to look at where the police's role in a capitalist state. Prior to capitalism, in the class society before capitalism, policing was literally in the hands of the people who owned and ran the land. Landlords had their own vigilantes, their own security services. If you didn't hand over your share of the crop, if you didn't hand over your rent, they came and beat you up, burned down your house. You can imagine the scenario I'm talking about. Modern capitalist democracy removed policing from the hands of the individual landowners and set it up as beyond partisan influence, beyond individual control. You know, that phrase, "No one is above the law." You know, we are all subject to the law. It's the law of the land. It's something removed from individuals. It's not your boss who runs the police force. It's not your housing association that runs the police force. It's something separate now. It's moved beyond individual avarice, individual self-interest. It's become part of the state. Now, that's why I think we need to talk a little bit about the nature of the state in capitalist society in order to understand the role of the police and to understand why racist policing is so prevalent, and nothing is done about it. Inquiry after inquiry, report after report, nothing is done about that. The capitalist state is there to try and set up this idea that as we're all now free to sell our labor power as we choose, that we all have the same legal rights as citizens, that if something bad happens to you because your company goes bust and you get laid off, the furlough ends, you lose your job. That's the market. It's not the product. It's not the result of individual bosses being nasty or bad. That's just the way the market works. If you get subject to police harassment, that's not because individual police officers are nasty or racist. It's because they have got reason to believe that you are more likely to be a criminal. I'm phrasing this badly. Let me try and come at this another way. The capitalist state is there to mediate between individuals in society, whether those individuals are corporations, bosses of corporations, homeless people on the street. We are all equal in the face of this state. That only works when people buy into that form of equality. So the capitalist state, the democratic processes are there to manage our consent to the capitalist world we live in. But you need, at the sharp end, if that consent isn't there, if people don't accept the values of the capitalist state, you need an armed force to enforce those class relations. And that's been the role of the police ever since they were founded. The police have always been the sharp end of enforcing capitalist democracy, whether it's the Enclosure Act that forced people off the land into the cities, whether it's something like 200 offences that carry the death penalty, most of them for crimes against property, whether it's policing the miners' strike, whether it's the death of Blair Peach, whether it's the use of the taser, things I've talked about earlier. The police have always been the sharp end of trying to enforce capitalist rules. By and large, they use ideological means. They use what Marx called the pulpit, I can't remember quite. They use the papers, the pulpit, the police. I won't try to quote. They use the press. They use pundits. They use the education system. They use other institutions like the church to enforce our consent to the capitalist system.
Let's say 5 minutes. Is that all right? 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I'll give you a chance to actually get this to some sensible conclusion. So what I'm trying to say badly is that there are tools that the capitalist state uses to maintain the existence of capitalist relations. Ideological tools, the kind of things I've just tried to refer to badly. But then behind that, there is the iron fist, there is the repressive tool, and that's the police. And the capitalist state itself is a source of racism in this society. We talk about how racism comes from the top of society. Let's just take a quick look at the Home Office, the government departments, the departments of the capitalist state that's responsible for the police. Look at the last three Home Secretaries. Theresa May, who coined the phrase hostile environment. Her predecessor, Andrea Leadsom, I think that's right, who was presided over the Windrush scandal. You look at Priti Patel now, who is now talking about deploying the Royal Navy in the Channel because 4,000 people crossed the Channel this year. Incidentally, wasn't that what Katie Hopkins lost her job on the Sun for advocating using gunboats in the Channel? But Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, is now advocating that. When the government department, when the government of this capitalist state is so imbued with racism, and this is not new. Thatcher, the swarms, when the government that is responsible for the policing, when the government department is responsible for policing, is imbued with racism, it is unsurprising that that racism filters its way down through every facet of policing. Whether individual police officers go into the police service with racist ideas or not, the institution itself is permeated with those ideas, permeated with the ideas that black people are more likely to be dealing drugs, they're more likely to be carrying knives. Hence the whole thing about stop and search. In a capitalist state with a that is imbued with racism, that has used racism since its very inception in order to build itself up and maintain its rule, it is highly, I would argue, completely unsurprising that the sharp boot boy at the end of the process to enforce capitalist relations is going to be racist. So I'm going to try and bring this to a conclusion. Sorry, there we go. So what I want to finish on is the pattern and persistence of police racism. The statistics I gave earlier should tell us there's something more than just individual bad apples. There's something systemic going on. And I want to link that to the nature of the state in capitalist society, a state that wants to keep us divided in order to maintain the wealth and the privilege of a small few. That racism is always going to be part of capitalist society. That racism will always be part of the way the sharp repressive tool of capitalism, the police force, operates. That's why I think the police are so racist. It's not an individual aberration. It's a systemic, ingrained nature of the capitalist system and the capitalist state that the police uphold.
Thanks, Vivek. That was a great introduction. I'm going to or make a longer contribution. That's fine. So please fire away. Okay. Who would like to be first? For anybody who's coming to the meeting late, we are recording it, so you can catch up on the bits you've missed, or even the whole meeting if so required. Okay, I've got Mark Collins first. Please go ahead, Mark. Unmute yourself.
You sure it's not Benjamin, Andy? Benjamin Collins. Could you hear me anyway?
Yes, we can always hear you.
Oh, that's no. I just want to sort of go on. First of all, I want to sort of go into detail about the Section 60. I just want to know if it's used now and again, or it's active all the time, or can it be? It's like only used in certain times. You know what I mean? Is it acted on by a judge or something that they can use it over a period of months, or is it some? You know, 'cause it seems like it seems Section 60 covers every aspect of every stop and search the police could do anyway. Is it basically is it 24/7, 360 times a year they can use it, or is it? Anyway, the point I want to make is after Stephen Lawrence's death, we went to a meeting that was held by the police, and they had a black policewoman representing the police, and it was about the Stephen Lawrence thing. It was at the Warwick University. We did a stall outside there. We went in and joined the debate. And the black woman says basically, the black police officer, basically, she said that there is racism in the police. There's no doubt about that. But she says that actually the racism in the police is not a reflection of the capitalist state as such or the state. It's a reflection of society. You know, she said that it's society that's racist, not the state. That's her argument, you know. Obviously, we're arguing it slightly differently. But I suppose it's like the argument that we've had on the sale, you know, just digressing slightly. It's very difficult when a young Muslim woman comes up and says, you know, there should be controlled immigration, there's too many people coming in. It's the same sort of argument in that way, you know. It's like we've got to turn it on its head, you know. And our argument to her was, you know, society doesn't wrap a black woman up in 15 meters of masking tape and then kill her, you know. It just doesn't happen, you know what I mean? There's racist things happening in the street, and but it's not that like that, you know. And she never really had an answer for it, you know. But there is a lot of black people joining the police, and it must be difficult for them, you know, especially people like Anne in the army as well, knowing that. But if you're a black woman joining the police force, it's easier to think of it that way. I think that society is racist, not the state and the police, and all her bosses are racist, because it would be easier to do your job. So it's a difficult position to be in, I should imagine, a black person in the police. I'll leave it there anyway.
Thanks, Mark. I should just say that Stand Up to Racism have produced a fact sheet about Section 60, stop and search. I guess you can find it online. Yeah. But there is a fact sheet being produced, because in some areas of the country, it's particularly London, it's a terrifically difficult issue for people to deal with locally. It's a very explosive issue. Patricia, raise your hand. You want to unmute yourself?
She's gone. I think she's been having internet problems.
Okay, Trisha's gone. Okay, so I haven't got anybody else. Dave Allen.
Okay, you can hear me, but you can't see me because my camera's broken. So I'm one worse off than Mark, although you're probably all better off. Yeah, couple of things. I mean, when my lads were at secondary school, one of their mates was a police sergeant. His father was a police sergeant, and you know, he's a perfectly amenable chap. You know, a bit of a bloke. He was okay. No hint of racism or anything about it. But talking to him one day, the boys had gone round their house for a party, so I'd take them around. I was commenting what a nice extension he had to his house. And he says, oh yeah, that was paid for by the miners' strike. You know, there's this whole thing that the police are so integrated into what the ruling class wants. And as we've discussed before, I think racism is part of the working class toolbox. And so they're going to be integrated into that. And when Mark was talking about the woman police officer at the at Warwickshire, at Warwick Uni, it put me in mind there was a woman's hour piece the other weekend with a young, well, not so young anymore, a Muslim woman who'd joined the police force. It had been sort of an early ambition of hers to be a police officer and all the rest of it. And eventually she couldn't take it anymore, just that the racism was so blatant. Once when she was working as a police constable, a detective constable, I think it's an inspector, would every now and then come into the office, and if she was anywhere standing around, he'd grab her and say, right, give us your money, or he gets it, you know. I'm not going to say the word because it's offensive, but this is kind of police, you know, what they call canteen culture. And what canteen culture is, basically, I suppose, in the police, the canteen is an area where they're not subject to discipline, so that they can behave like themselves. And this canteen culture is notorious for being racist, sexist, homophobic, the whole gamut, really. And it's not about, like the police sergeant I was talking about earlier, it's not about whether the individual police officer is particularly woke or nasty individual. It's about the job and what it does to them. And in order to get on, you have to get on, don't you? You have to get on with people in order to get promoted. And the way to do that is to fit in. Yes, it fit in to get on, isn't it? So I think the problem is within the society we have, it's something that's insurmountable. I don't see a solution to it other than defund them and set up something different. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Trisha's back in the meeting, I think. Are you there, Trisha? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry about this. It keeps on failing. I'm on a different piece of IT now, but yeah, thank you very much, Vivek. What I heard of it was brilliant. I just want to pick on one thing, and that's a little bit about tasers. When Darren Cumberbatch was killed, I started drawing tasers, thinking that they somehow might be used for a campaign, and I did this taser 5 times. So in the process, I found a bit about tasers, and they are absolutely monstrous weapons. They have these little end pieces, like little arrows on the end. You shoot them, and these rods, these double taser was what I drew, and you shoot them, and these 2 angles go out of cords to the person and actually pierce the body. They're just incredible things that can cause all kinds of injuries and actually kill people through heart attacks, etc. And then quite blasé, we read and hear about there are extra 500 people or 500 police people officers being trained to use tasers, or an extra 800 have been trained. And it's glibly passed through on the media, and I just think we need to look at the use of them and somehow campaign against them. They're just terrible, but they seem to be now acceptable. And when we look at these shots of people, the way that these tasers are being pulled out at people now, it's so much more frequent than it used to be. It's like a knee-jerk, because they've trained so many more officers to use them. So I just thought I'd mention something about that. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. Just while people are gathering their thoughts, I'd just like to ask the question of Vivek: how would a socialist society be different? Would we have police? Because let's face it, most of human history has been no such thing as a police. The birth of the modern police with Robert Peel and all that came about pretty much roughly with the dawn of industrial capitalism in the 1830s, 1840s. Before that, policing had been done by the soldiery or yeomanry, which is essentially a voluntary militia of the local squirearchy and the well-to-do, the kind of people who committed the massacre at Peterloo. How would we organise that kind of discipline in a socialist society? Would we need to, and would it look anything like the current setup that we have? Okay, I haven't got anybody else. Mike, unmute yourself.
And
Can you hear me? Can you
Yeah.
hear me? No?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? I guess working class people, I mean, like, to join the police force, it's one of the few jobs where a lot of working class people can get a decent income, a good pension, and it's a good secure job where you can get promotions to become chief superintendent and have a big house in the country and who knows what. So it's one of the few areas where a working class lad or lass can get on in the world. It's always been kind of the way. I think back in Ireland and stuff, back in the 30s and 40s, like, employment and stuff, a lot of people were recruited into the army, especially Irish people recruited to the British Army and went off, you know, on the imperialist adventures and stuff. And kind of, so I think your question as well, like, could we manage without a police force? I mean, I think, is it, I don't know if it is possible for a capitalist state with a police force which is there to protect that state, which is based on an economic system of exploitation and inequality and coercion, etc. So I guess, you know, if you join the police, you might be joining the police with good intentions or whatever, but you'll have to do things that will go against you. I mean, it's kind of those, I mean, you know, there was awful things in the 30s when people have had to do terrible things, you know, that they, like, you know, they've had to, like, crawl on their belly just to feed the family and stuff, you know, and they've had to do, and the capitalism have had to do things they probably hate doing. So I don't know how many individual police officers would be racist, but I guess if you're in that kind of work, it's going to be kind of taint you anyway. It's going to kind of corrupt you in a way. But I sort of saw a community policeman today, chatting to him. Jerry seemed a nice fella. A bit of antisocial behaviour here, you know, and working people, you know, like back in Belfast and stuff. You had like the Sinn Féin and that, and they would actually take, you know, they would get drug dealers there and antisocial elements, and there's certain ways of dealing with that. I know that people on the left sometimes disagree, but I don't know. Sometimes, you know, working that's one area where working class community actually took control of it. So yeah, sometimes you'll get antisocial behaviour, and so the police force is supposed to help that, but maybe a lot of times they don't live in those communities. So, you know, how do people police their communities? When does it become vigilantism and stuff? These are big questions for socialists. Don't have any easy answers to that. But I guess as long as we have a capitalist state, and you know, I think really is no alternative. I mean, it will be racist. I mean, it just goes without saying. So, you know, that's all then. Anyway, I think I've gone long enough now. Cheers.
Thanks, Mick. I've got Tamsin next.
Hello. As some of you may know, I've got a cousin who used to be in the Metropolitan Police. He's gone back to Calcutta now. To me, it's I'm thinking about a comment he made on Ollie's Facebook a few months ago. It was when the guy in Manchester was tasered with his son that was with him. And I want to compare it to my job in mental health. So in mental health, I mean, you know, there's entrenched racism there as well. I mean, you're much more likely to be restrained if you're black or from an ethnic minority, much more likely to be restrained if you're a woman. And, you know, there are particular things that you're more likely to get diagnosed with if you're a woman or a man. But one of the things is Ollie had posted the video of the guy getting tasered and, you know, look at the police behaviour, this is disgraceful and this kind of thing. And my relative waded in with, he was about to get aggressive. And, you know, I replied with, if that was mental health and the guy was just getting a bit verbal, you'd be trying to talk to him and listen to him. You'd be talking him down. There is no way you'd be trying to restrain that person. But you're talking about going in with a taser, you know. And I was thinking about, you know, the difference between what the police are allowed to do to people and what we were allowed to do in mental health. Thankfully, not as much, and that's definitely a good thing. You know, it's things like when the police would bring someone in from the street for assessment. You know, occasionally I'd see them. Well, basically, if someone started to ramp up in their distress, I'm going to call it, and start to behave in a way that might be difficult to manage, then, you know, if the police were still there, they'd be, you know, jumping in. They'd be, you know, there was a young woman once, and this guy had this particular technique of tripping her over, basically, and she was flat on her face. And I just thought it was really nasty. You know, and things like there was I used to work on what's called a 136 suite, which is where people are brought in from the street for assessment under section 136 to see if they will then be sectioned under section 2 or released back into the community. So they're often brought in by the police. So in a similar 136 suite in Birmingham, as you may know, there was a guy who was killed by the police. They were, probably like holding him down, and I don't know exactly what happened, but see, when we're taught to restrain people, one of the things that you're taught is how people can die in restraint and how you have to be careful. They get a build-up of acid in their joints, and they can die of ketoacidosis, which is one of the things that's on the list of what this guy in Birmingham died of. So he'd probably been restrained, not allowed to move in any way, and because he's straining against that, as you would resist that, he's got this build-up of acid in his joints, and that's been a contributory factor in his death. So, again, we'd be, trying to think about, like for example, when I first started working mental health, you were trained with restraint with people face down. By the time I left, we were told, no, you just don't do that. If someone's being troublesome, you try and keep them on their knees. You can still keep them controlled and stop them attacking people. But whereas the police, it would seem that, restraining people face down is, that's perfectly normal, that's completely allowed. But also I want to compare again, tasering. Again, there's my cousin talking about tasering this guy who's just getting a bit verbal, and that's all. He's posed no threat to anybody. In mental health, in order to get the police to come out and taser someone, you have to read a script. There is we have a escalating situation. There's a real threat to life or limb. You need to come out and taser this person. So the example I gave to my cousin was, we had this guy who broke into the unit during a night shift with a men at work sign. That's a great big metal sign. He could easily have caused someone injury. That's the kind of thing you taser people for. It's still, I don't want to taser anybody, just to be clear, but there's a difference in why you might do it and why you absolutely wouldn't. And again, there was a chap on the PQ, Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit, and he had somehow secreted lots of pens and was holding them, so they were sticking out like claws, and people couldn't restrain him because he'd have attacked them with the pens. You'd be thinking about, I think, in mental health, tasering him because there was no way to bring him down. He was a risk to anybody to all the members of staff and patients. But if someone's just going to talk at you or they're running away from you, that's the kind of thing that the police taser you for. And that's just really, they're people who don't pose any kind of risk. It's not nice to taser anybody, but, there's a difference between whether someone's just talking at you a bit or whether someone's actually going to hit you with a 3 foot by 3 foot metal sign.
Thanks, Tamsin. Yeah, I just want to ask a question before Dave Kersey comes in. A couple of times we've seen in the Black Lives Matter protest a bit of a break in the sort of canteen culture solidarity of the police, whereby they've took the knee, or in other ways shown themselves to be relatively sympathetic. They took the knee, a policeman took the knee when the people marched on the motorway in Coventry and came off the motorway to sort of honour them, if you like. It's happened in America a few times, and also the police in Bristol, when the statue of Edward Colston was took down and thrown in the harbour, they stood by and sort of basically said, well, it would have been a greater disorder if we tried to stop it, kind of thing, which was basically giving a nod and a wink. Those breaks in the solidarity of the police are important, I think. It's not a revolutionary situation yet, but I think it's always important that we should take that into account. Accounts of the Russian Revolution talked about the Cossacks giving a nod and a wink to the women protesting about. and that was a break in, you know, that was an indicator of how the tide was turning. I'm not saying that what's happened with Black Lives Matter is that, but anyway, I just wonder what people think about that. Dave?
Okay, just want to say three things, I think. One is, it's very clear that there's a stark difference between how people who are not white get treated by the police and people who are white. And I spoke to people at work a few weeks ago, some of whom had been on Black Lives Matter protests, and it was the people who are not white who I spoke to were saying that it's not about, you know, just getting stopped or always being beaten up or tasered all the time, but it's the attitude of the police on a day-to-day level that is just completely different. And I had an argument with, well, it wasn't a really serious argument, but I had a disagreement with my brother who was supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, but was trying to defend, he posted a defence of the police by a police officer. And I said to him, well, as a white person who's in a kind of professional role at work, I never get checked by the police in my day-to-day life. It doesn't happen. I don't get stopped in the street. I don't get my car stopped when I'm driving, etc. But nearly all the people I work with who are not white get that on a regular basis, and stopping of cars is the most regular one, it would appear. Driving offences, you get picked up all the time if you're Asian or African Caribbean. It doesn't happen to white people as much at all. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that the thing I always say about the police is they're absolutely hopeless if you're victim of a crime, of a real crime. So I remember when my mum got burgled and the police came round, and there was no point in the police being there. In fact, they tried to accuse me. I was a teenager at the time, and I happened to be wearing the same style of shoe as the burglar that had got the. So they were trying to pin this burglar. I thought I burgled my own mother. Anyway, the point is, you know, you only report a crime to the police because you need to for insurance purposes. There really is no other reason to do so. And that's, you know, loads of people have told me similar stories. But the third thing I think, partly in reply to what Andy was saying, is how would you replace the police? What would happen if the police disappeared in a puff of smoke overnight? And I always say, well, you know, it's interesting. Mick was talking about, so now the area Mick lives in Coventry is an area I used to work in, and I always say that in Henley Green, Wood End, Bell Green, where there is a high level of antisocial behaviour, or there was at the time, and I think Mick's saying that's still the case. But I always know that the people who did most to address that issue at the time were youth workers who set up projects to get young people engaged and dealt with young people's issues and barriers and dealt with it very well. And they set up, for example, a really good project working with me, with music, and they set up a really good project getting young people involved in car crime to strip down cars and learn how to put cars together, and several of them became mechanics and got really good jobs as a result of that. And likewise, you know, social workers, I'm not saying that because Mamoon listening in, but social workers and people in the kind of role that Tam's in do far more effective work to deal with the antisocial behaviour or criminal behaviour, either preventative or rehabilitative, if that's the word, than the police ever do. And you could argue a similar case, I guess, if they were ever resourced properly for some probation officers. So, you know, the causes of crime are economic and social primarily, and the solutions to people being involved in criminal behaviour are also primarily economic and social. And it's about giving people the support, and it's professional. You have to put heavy resources in to support people who've been left behind. So no, you can't just have a tick box solution. You need teams of professionals to work together across boundaries, and that needs big resources put into the public sector so that there's professionals available to do it. So, you know, I think that's the point. It's community. Angela Davis, there's a video on YouTube. She's wrote a book about advocating the abolition of prisons. And what she says is that, you know, you can see the kernel of what kind of model could exist for justice in things like community payback or community rehabilitation, because, you know, it's not the case that you just let people do whatever they want. It's a case of them of having collective responsibility and saying to people, you know, you need to address what you're doing, and these are solutions that at community level we think we should, you know, we would develop for you. But the police rarely, you know, don't really have much to say on that. All they do is pick people out to punish, and it's not always the right people that they find.
Thanks, Dave. I've got Mark, if you could keep it fairly brief, Mark, because, you know, it's getting on to 8:30, so.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, my question is about this relationship between the police and the state and the community. Because when there was a lot of knifing in Toxteth and places like that in Brixton, most black people in them areas know the police are racist, but a lot were saying, in that community, were saying we need more police in the area. There's a contradiction going on between trying to overcome antisocial behaviour in areas and crime, at the same time deal with the racist police in the state. I don't know how. When I was at Cummins, I'll just quickly say, when I was at Cummins, I talked about the Iraqi war and how wrong it was. And I raised the question, and about 15, 20 people were there. And I said the army should choose, the soldiers should choose whether they should go and fight it or not by a ballot, you know, secret ballot. Should we engage in this war? And the government should give them that choice. Anyway, I think about one person agreed with me, you know, they thought it's ridiculous. So, but the police, again, it's like they have these crimes and people want more police in who are racist from the state. There's a contradiction going on. And I don't know how to, in my mind, how to unravel it, if you see what I mean. I don't know how to, people don't want crime, but they want the police as well. I'll leave it there. It's just an open-ended confusion I've got. All right.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, society's full of contradictions, and that's one of them. Tamsin wanted to speak again, I think. If you could keep it.
Yeah. Dave, I thought that was a brilliant contribution, and yeah, I think that's right. You know, there are all sorts of other people who contribute to reductions in crime, and you know, much more constructively. And as people have said before, most crime is property related. But I was also thinking about domestic violence, and again, politically, how would we deal with that? And this is something, you know, I think about quite a lot. Maybe because you know, so many women I've met will talk about, well, you know, my partner's abusive, I can't leave because I can't get housing. And what I always end up thinking is, you know, these kind of crimes would be eliminated by the fact that, you know, with more available resources, with production for human need, there would be more housing, people would not be on waiting lists. And the simple fact is, if a majority of women could walk away and leave violent men, then it would not be in the interests of those men to continue being violent. They'd, you know, that would be quite isolating for them, I'd imagine, and might change those patterns of behaviour amongst other aspects of social change that would change those patterns of behaviour. So I always think a lot of violent crime can be changed by the simple fact that the victims of it would have access to resources that would enable them to leave. For example, there was an article I've put on our SUTR page about how women who don't speak English are being denied places in domestic violence refuges. Again, you know, that to me is horrifying. You know, these are the most vulnerable women because they probably don't have any access to public funds. I mean, firstly, we wouldn't make anybody, you know, not have access to public funds. Everybody would have access to the means to live, wouldn't they? And, you know, I think that the same can be said of any person in society, whether that's, you know, vulnerable adults, for example, or any other group. I mean, I was having a discussion with a patient a few months ago who was talking about their mother being abusive when they were a child. And I was saying, you know, oh yeah, because this person was a lot younger than me. And I was saying, yeah, during the 80s, I remember a few cases in the US of children divorcing their parents. And I was saying, I think that's a great idea. You know, if your parents are horrible, you could divorce them. You'd be given the resources to live, or you'd be given live somewhere, you know, you'd have a choice about where you went, wouldn't you? That would eliminate that kind of crime, wouldn't it? Abuse of children, you know, providing the resources that everybody needs for their sustenance would eliminate a lot of power of one group over another, or one individual over another. If people have the resources to just leave unpleasant situations, that eliminates that power relationship that currently exists. I always think as well, I'll be quiet in a minute, but our universal credit and how that has changed the dynamic in a lot of conventional, you know, male, female, 2 kids kind of households. Tax credits, for example, were paid largely to women, and all the benefits then to men. I mean, that's not a rule, it's what happens. And it tended to be what happened during the 80s, before universal credit, before tax credits and that kind of thing, under Thatcher. And now under the Tories, again, all money is under universal credit, is paid to one person in the household, and that tends to be the man. Not always, but largely. And that again puts everybody, therefore, in that household under that one person's control and influence. That gives that's a blank check to domestic abusers, really, I think, and is really, really awful. So, you know, I think again with the way we would run society, as I say, would mean everybody would have what they needed to live. It would eliminate that kind of controlling behaviour, and that would eliminate a lot of that kind of crime. You need to unmute yourself, Andy. We can't hear you.
If anybody who hasn't, thanks, Tamsin. If anybody who hasn't spoken yet wants to chip in with a small contribution before I ask Vivek to come back, then please indicate now. Okay, I don't think anybody has. So I will ask Vivek to sum up and answer any questions that came up there.
Okay, thank you. A very wide-ranging discussion there. I'm going to start with how would it be different under socialist society, because I think that's the subject of a whole other meeting. Just a couple of things I would say about that. I think in immediate aftermath of a revolution, we would still need some kind of way to manage people's adherence to the new society that we're building. In particular, I'm thinking about those who we've just dispossessed. We would need some way to manage them. There would be we would have to have some kind of state. Our classic argument is that there would be a proletariat state that will manage the transition from capitalism to socialism, and then will wither away as it becomes no longer necessary to have a state. I think there will be a state. I think the state will have to enforce the will of the mass of society as expressed through a proletariat state. But we see little examples all the time about how we would look after ourselves, how we would manage ourselves. It occurred to me while you were asking that question, Tiananmen Square, how people protected each other, looked out for each other, how instances of sexual harassment went down, instances of petty thieving went down. In those situations, when people actually feel they have some say in the world, some say in how their society is run, those things start to evaporate, and people find their own ways to manage these things. You know, the Russian Revolution, Paris Commune, but Tiananmen Square came to mind while you asked that question. Okay, I think it's a subject of another meeting. I'm not going to try and do it any more justice than that. I wanted to go to what I think is the central thing about this. No, let me do one other thing first. Joining the police. What's the impact of the police in dealing with crime? Look, I was trying to look up the figures while the discussion was going on. I couldn't find them immediately to hand, but I should have perhaps looked these up beforehand. The clear up rates for policing for most crimes is abysmally low. It's desperately pointless. I mean, you know, as I think Dave said, you know, you only report a burglary, so you can do your insurance claim. I mean, the clear-up rate for most offences is appalling. And I was just, you know, in particular, Section 60 searches. In only 2% Section 60 searches is a knife or offensive weapon found. In only 3% of Section 60 stopping searches is any kind of charge followed on from that. You know, they are completely pointless, meaningless exercises in terms of what they say they do, which is to solve crime or to stop crime or prevent crime. Why do the police desperately want to cling on to these things? Why do they want to do these things? Well, firstly, it's immediately trying to create an atmosphere that there are certain cultures, certain groups of people who are criminally minded, who've got criminal behaviour, in particular this context, black communities in urban situations. You know, so it's trying to create this image of there are problems in our society, there are problem people in our society. Rather than, as I think it was David said, you know, the poverty, the inequality are the real drivers of most so-called criminal activity. Secondly, it's a high-profile thing that they can then say, we need more money, we need more resources. They're like any other bit of the state. They're fighting with the treasury for resources. If they can say, look, we did all these stop and Section 60 stop and searches, we did this, we did that, we need more money, we need more resources, we need more police. It's just good PR for them. Just on Section 60. Section 60 orders don't require a judge's authorization. It's a chief superintendent. Senior police officer can issue a Section 60 notice. It can be for up to 48 hours. It's geographic. As I think I said, the guidance is supposed to be the smallest required area, but it can be as much as, I mean, so I live in Haringey. There have been borough-wide Section 60 orders issued you know, for 48 hours, which just means the police can go and stop and search without even having reasonable grounds. The difference, why Section 60 is different from other stop and search powers, is you do not have to have reasonable grounds under Section 60. Under the PACE, Police Criminal Evidence Act, and the misuse of drugs, you have to have reasonable grounds to stop and search someone. Section 60 removes the requirement for reasonable grounds. You just have to have the belief that someone's up to no good. And obviously, that is conditioned by the society we live in. And so I want to come to what I think is the last thing I want to kind of address is that, yes, racism is exists in society. So I want to come to that question about, you know, is it the society, is it the state, is it the police? It's the problem. It's a racist society. It's a society built on inequality, oppression, discrimination. You know, racism was constructed at the very birth of capitalism to justify the slave trade, and it's continued to be, as someone said, a tool in the toolbox of the ruling class. Now, it's a society where a tiny number of people have almost all the wealth and power, and the rest of us are scrambling around for the rest. And in that scrabbling around, we channel each other, child abuse, domestic violence, all the things that Tam talked about are prevalent in us. We don't have control over your life. You don't control over the society you live in. We don't feel that you can influence those people at the top. There is that possibility of turning in on each other. It's a race. It's a class-ridden, unequal, oppressive society. One of those oppressions is racism. That runs through the state. As I try to talk about the examples, you look at the last 3 Home Secretaries, look at what they're, look at Preeti Patel. You know, when you know, then in Jerry's Ice Cream, write to her saying, please don't deploy a gun budget for 4,000 people. Try and be humane about it. She then describes them as junk food peddlers. I mean, this is the level of the racism of Preeti Patel. And previous Home Secretaries have been equally as bad. You know, when you've got a racist society, the society that racism is used to prop up the interests of the small number of rich and powerful. The repressive tool of that society, the police, will be a racist tool. You know, they use ideology to get us to adhere to this society, and that ideology is riddled with racism, sexism, homophobia. Look at the gutter press over the last few days about 4,000 refugees coming across this year from Calais. Look at the vitriol that's going on around that. But the ideological tools riddled with racism, the repressive hard edge of the capitalist state is riddled with racism, and I think that's why the police are racist. Individual police officers may well go into the police force with hopefully decent ideas and with aspirations to try and do good for the community. Lots of police officers actually are racist. Again, I was trying to look up the figures for how many police officers were suspended for connections with far-right organisations. I couldn't find the right page, but there's just, as I mentioned, it's one just locally to me, just in the last few weeks. The police officers who were on duty the day the Blair Peach were killed, lots of racist literature in their lockers, illegal weapons. These are the hard edge of a state that is seeking to prop up a small number of people over the rest of us. They will use racism as part of that weapon, and the police are going to be part of that. But I want to finish on a more positive note. You see, I don't think that means there's nothing for us to say or do. I think the sheer wave of the movement that's come out of the death of George Floyd, the tragedy of George Floyd's murder, means I think that there is an opportunity here to do something. The fact that the demand of the civil rights movement from the late 50s to defund the police actually might happen in a city like Minnesota under a Trump administration, not under Obama, under a Trump presidency. We might see the police defunded. Now, obviously, there is debate about what that actually means. I think what it means in this case is not going to be they shut down the entire police department, don't have one. This is still a capitalist society. It will still want to enforce capitalist laws. What they are talking about, and what other cities and states are talking about, is actually saying we're going to cut funding to police and put it into the community. Now that's a real demand that we should be getting behind. Someone referred to the anti-racism briefing on Section 60. I think that is a demand that is winnable. Section 60 is just so discredited. Liberty have been fighting this question for years. There's been one Supreme High Court challenge on it. There will be others. I think that's a campaign we should get behind. I think whether police are allowed to carry tasers is something we should get behind, because I think as Tamsin described very was it Tamsin? No, it was Trish described how the impact of tasers and some of the stories I talked about that happened locally to me here in North London. It just show that it's used as an offensive weapon. It's used discriminatorily against black and ethnic minority people. So I think there are real demands that we can actually get behind and win, and those demands will open up the question of what I think is at the heart of this. What kind of state, what kind of society are we in when it's policed by people who are allowed to get away with this? When the people who have got powers given to them by the state beyond what you and I have. Racism is in society. There are racists in everything. Even in the NHS, we've seen that there's disproportionate deaths of trained workers. I'm just finishing on this. Even in the NHS, there are issues to be addressed. But porters in the NHS, nurses in the NHS, don't have the powers that are given to the police by a racist state and a racist society. Challenging their continued use of those powers, access to those powers, is something that we should get behind, and it does open up the question about what kind of world we live in, who runs that world, and in whose interest. And I think there's a possible prospect to make some changes on that. I'm very excited about it.